My name is Halle Keeney, and this is a presentation over my applied assignment, Living with Disabilities, A Difference Between the 70s and Now. So jumping right into it, we're going to be discussing disability, inclusion, and accessibility in the 70s. We can get perspectives from people who lived in the 70s, whether that's in conversation or by watching documentaries to get primary examples on what their lives had looked like then. It can help us understand what challenges people with disabilities have overcome, and especially on the importance on disability policy and laws by seeing the cause and their effect. Before the civil rights movement, people with disabilities were treated very differently. Sometimes this was inhumanely, they were sheltered or hidden by their families, even institutionalized, which received minimal rights. We have come a long way since the 70s in regards to accessibility. From minimal wheelchair accessibility and institutionalization, there was definitely a need for reform. Advocating for the accessibility led to the passing of legislations like the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the IDEA, in 1975, and the Americans with Disability Act, the ADA, in 1990. Both of these just ensured certain rights for people with disabilities. The IDEA was more of a focus on specialized education for people with disabilities, and the Americans with Disability Act was a focus on disability rights as a whole and making sure that nobody was being discriminated against. Accessibility is utilized by more than people who just have disabilities or impairments, and implementing aspects of what is called universal design, which are means of design that everybody can use no matter their abilities, can be extremely beneficial in a community. We see examples of this in menus that have braille, large print, or even multilingual options, and this just allows for people to not have to ask for any sort of accommodating options. This also allows people to feel inclusion in groups who may be marginalized, allowing to feel accepted in a community. Inclusion-based practices can also change our mindsets that we may have towards other groups, like those with disabilities. In the 70s, stereotypes and stigmas that stem from disabilities made inclusion very difficult. These attitudinal barriers created biases that can be negative. Schools were inaccessible and had very minimal specialized educational resources, and students who did use these resources were often pointed out and made fun of for it. When we open the door for inclusion, we can collaborate with others in a mutual engaged conversation or environment, allowing to create an understanding. We can use these experiences as intergroup contact theory to reduce discrimination and to bridge the gap between majority and minority groups. Obviously, some of us may never experience life in a wheelchair. However, if we take the time to engage with somebody in a mutual willing conversation, we may understand their perspectives in their life and gain a way better understanding. The path to legislation and disability rights begins in the 1960s with the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, and this served as a forefront to gaining many other rights for marginalized groups, including people with disabilities. They even used the Brown versus Board of Education, a well-known landmark case on the 14th Amendment, which deemed the separate but equal a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. This can be seen in the upper right-hand corner. During segregation, the separate but equal policy was used to have segregation in schools, deeming that it best served communities. However, they took this to court, challenging it, and it won. Again, deeming it a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. And this really did pave the way to gaining disability and accessibility rights for those with disabilities. The 70s offered other legislation that followed, such as the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, the EHA, and was signed into law by President Ford in 1975. This allowed all handicapped children to attend public schools and begin implementing specialized programs like 504 and IEP plans. This later became the Individuals with Disability Act, and in the 90s was, and then later amended by President Obama in 2015, now known as the Every Student Succeeds Act. The Americans with Disability Act was passed in 1990 by George H.W. Bush following many protests and advocacy done by people with disabilities, like sit-ins and the well-known Capitol Crawl. This Capitol Crawl was a movement done by people with disabilities where they gathered at the bottom of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., and attempted or successfully crawled up the Capitol building either with support or with mobility aids to advocate for the rights of people with disability. This passage further protected people with disabilities from discrimination, mistreatment, and ensured their rights. In this assignment and getting perspectives, we can look at the passings of legislation such as the IDEA and ADA for how monumental they have been for people with disabilities. Policies and laws have evolved to ensure things like proper education and caretaking are done to support potential needs. Seeing how others are impacted by said legislations can be eye-opening to their necessity. Other practices like testing for genetic markings for disabilities, vaccinations, and other diagnoses have evolved greatly, better serving everybody's health. Taking the time to gain perspective from family, friends, or someone from your community on their lived experiences can open our minds on the realities that people with disabilities face or what they've overcome. Spending our time to educate ourselves on the differences and experiences can help us understand perspectives. This also allows us to challenge biases or stereotypes that we may have about people with disabilities, even if they are inherent. This potentially promotes a growth mindset as well. For this assignment, I wanted to interview somebody who had lived in the 70s with a disability, and I had the pleasure of choosing my mom, who was diagnosed with PCOS in the late 70s and early 80s. For my interview, I interviewed my mother and I asked her a series of about 12 questions. For the sake of this presentation, I went ahead and just reduced it to about 6. And these really just discussed how she feels the PCOS diagnosis and living with disabilities shaped her, and how she feels about that diagnosis now. So just jumping right into it, this first slide is going to be more about how she feels her PCOS diagnosis affected her as a child and how it shaped her. The first question I asked her was, when were you diagnosed with PCOS and how did you feel about that? My mom was diagnosed with PCOS in the early 80s as she began puberty, and she was unaware of her differences, notably the excess body hair and underdevelopment in her breast and body. These quote-unquote issues were actually noticed by her mom, my grandma, who took her in to seek diagnosis and treatments. She notes becoming extremely self-conscious of her body, often being drawn to look at her peers in comparison to herself. Next, I asked her, what were your symptoms and what treatments did you receive? She says that the symptoms consisted of excess body hair, underdevelopment in her body, poor eyesight, and low body weight. Lots of blood testing had to be done monthly to monitor her health, her blood levels, her hormone levels, and this led to a fear of needles, and it had anxiety at hospitals. Hormone replacement therapies and androgen blockers in pill form were prescribed, which often led to side effects like fatigue. Finally, I asked her, how were you treated because of your disabilities? She says that although being diagnosed with PCOS, due to the invisible nature of her disability, she was not placed into any sort of specialized education, unlike her brother Chris, who was diagnosed with ADHD before his schooling had begun. She was treated worse by her family, as she states, like her mom and her brother, who were aware of her differences and made a spectacle out of her because of it. Due to Chris's ADHD, he was held back and oftentimes led her classmates to believe that her and Chris were twins, creating more confusion and judgment from her peers. So just to wrap up on this slide, essentially the PCOS diagnosis was undetected by my mom, but just noticed by her own mother. She never noticed any symptoms, but it quickly created a lot of self-consciousness in her body, and she just felt very different because of this. It also created a lot of anxiety relating to her health, and it created a fear of needles, and other side effects from her medicines were not good for her as well. So the second half of the interview, more about how she feels about the diagnosis now. I just asked her another set of 3 questions. The first being, what were your experiences or attitude relating towards disabilities at the time in the 70s? She said because her brother Chris was diagnosed with extreme anxiety at a young age and he needed accommodations such as extracurriculars like karate to keep energy managed, being held back due to reading comprehension, and being placed in the specialized education class, she understood that people were born with differences in disabilities and saw the special education class as an quote-unquote island of the misfit toys where anyone who wasn't neurotypical or who was disabled would go. I asked her if she had any other diagnoses now, in which she answered that she now has a hypermobility diagnosis, something that she believes was the issue not all along, not her PCOS. She never experienced infertility or ovarian cysts and continued her regular adult life, even conceiving 4 biological children. While there are similar comorbidities in both hypermobility and PCOS, like hormone imbalances, weight fluctuation, um, and hair loss, due to the lack of research or knowledge of hypermobility, it was likely unnoticed. Finally, I asked her, how do you feel about your PCOS diagnosis now?" She says that the PCOS diagnosis has essentially been abandoned. "My mom has an aversion to allopathic medicine as a result of these experiences and feeling so failed by the medical system in the 70s and the 80s. Since receiving her hypermobility diagnosis, she has turned to homeopathic and natural remedies to support her needs and experiences with hypermobility, which she does say she feels best serves her." Some key takeaways from the interview show me the importance of policy and law play ensuring the rights and care for certain groups, especially marginalized uh, communities and minorities. Without the advancements we have made in passing the Civil Rights Act, people with disabilities would be without guaranteed education, facing discrimination in communities, and denied basic human rights. Comparing and contrasting how attitudes have changed in the decades since 1964 gave me more insight on stereotypes and the lack of experiences can affect our biases. Becoming more aware of diversity and promoting equity and inclusion can promote growth in our society one step at a time. In discussing her experiences again and relating them to my own personal knowledge and understanding, we both expressed the need for more resources and accessibility for people with disabilities. We need mental health facilities, physical therapy options, and accessible infrastructure that supports universal design in our town to promote the accessibility and inclusion. In the 70s, there were practically no options for post-secondary living past the required schooling, which often ended around age 12 and 13. Post-secondary schooling, or post-secondary living is essentially anything past school, whether that's a higher education like college or joining the workforce, becoming a part of an institution, or a care facility program. Home or care institutionalization were often a result in the 70s following school, and there is now a need for more post-secondary support. Currently, students in Harrisonville, which is my own small town, in the special ed program develop IEP and 504 plans with their parents to discuss their future post-secondary plans. Students with more profound disabilities attend school until around the age of 20, where they begin their next transition in life, which is often extremely important in their lives due to the drastic changes in nature and education or their living arrangements. Post-secondary plans like college can greatly make or break an individual with disabilities' ability to apply for a job in the workforce. Following this assignment, a few questions I had generated were: where in my community can I insert myself to advocate for people with disabilities as well as their accessibility and inclusion? I have people in my family with profound and complex disabilities, as well as both of my parents and including myself, both having disabilities as well. So, following this class, I really understood and grasped just how much we still need to be promoting accessibility and inclusion, especially in communities like my small town where it just hasn't been taking off as much. I'd like to really be engaged in it and start promoting that more. Following that, I'd like to know my town's future goals for implementing resources and infrastructure to support people with disabilities. I'd like to know when we're going to have curb cuts in the square, when we're going to have sidewalks in Jefferson Parkway, which is a major road, especially when it's a snow route, because days like today, which we were saved like 4 inches of snow, people with wheelchairs would not be able to travel on that road safely. I'd also like to know if there's any plans for an updated wing in the high school for the special education program that isn't just a small hidden hallway. Finally, I'd also like to know the history of my town's accessibility and inclusion and how that has changed from the 70s. I myself plan on being a future high school history teacher, and I think understanding the history from all groups, especially in communities such as my own, regarding accessibility and inclusion, can be extremely beneficial in promoting the future accessibility and inclusion and helping others gain a mutual general understanding um, and shared relation towards people with disabilities. I look forward to continuing my journey in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and continuing to make changes in my community one day at a time.